Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us this week we have Jared Stone and Nick Morris, and we're going to be discussing a state that's been in the news a lot lately. It's the state of South Carolina. People have been really paying attention to the state lately because of the 2018 results in South Carolina and because of a 2020 Senate race, which is probably the most competitive Senate race South Carolina has had this century. Whether or not you think it's actually competitive, you'll kind of have to make up your mind as we show you the data here. We're going to be explaining everything you need to know about South Carolina to get prepared not only for this race, but for the future of South Carolina politics, which, although this is a red state, it's an interesting state in a lot of ways. One of them is that Republicans actually have a lot of strength in urban areas, and geographically, the Democratic base is kind of dispersed throughout the center of the state of South Carolina. A lot of this is rooted in majority minority African American areas, but the point being is that you see a lot of actually the coalitions tending to flip here, where there's a lot of rural Democrats and a lot of urban Republicans. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and start here with going over these metropolitan areas because I think it's really useful to understanding South Carolina. So these are the metropolitan areas of South Carolina, or rather the combined statistical areas. And then I have another map to show you, which is of the regions. I've made 3 political regions of South Carolina, but this kind of gets this out of the way first. So South Carolina is not an incredibly large state. It's in the top half of states in terms of population. Population is fairly dense relative to its size. It's only the 40th largest state by size, so it does punch a little bit above its weight in terms of population. So these are the combined statistical areas. So as you can see here, the biggest one by far is Greenville, Spartanburg. This is anchored around the northern portion of the state. A lot of this is in Appalachia. Some of it's connected economically to North Carolina or to areas in Georgia. And it's very heavily populated, obviously anchored in 2 big cities like Greenville and Spartanburg, but also in the area around Clemson University and Seneca. Clemson is unusual in that even though it's a college town and a very large university, the area as a whole actually kind of leans Republican or is more of a toss-up area. It's not nearly as Democratic as places like in the mountains comparable, like, for example, Western Carolina in Jackson County or Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. A little bit of a difference there compared to North Carolina. Next up is the Columbia area, and I'll kind of go ahead and show you these that we're talking about here. Columbia is rooted around the state capital of Columbia, but it also encompasses areas like Orangeburg and some other areas around here, Newberry, places like that. This is a very diverse area, 38% African American, and you notice it's politically competitive, whereas Greenville Spartanburg is very Republican, giving Republicans regularly around 64, 63% of the vote. Columbia is very competitive. In 2016, Hillary Clinton would have won it by around 3. Tim Scott would have won it by 7. And then the Democratic candidate for governor in 2018 would have won it by around 11. James Smith, who represented parts of Columbia in the state legislature. Myrtle Beach is another Republican anchor. You'll notice here that it's a very solidly Republican area, and similar to adjacent areas like Brunswick County in North Carolina, it's a very conservative location with a lot of retirees and snowbirds that have come in from other states. Then we start getting into smaller ones, or not smaller ones, but actually the 3rd largest metro in the state is Charleston. So you'll notice here that while people talk about Charleston as a competitive area, and it is, on a whole, it was only marginally Republican in 2016. It voted around 11,000 votes in favor of Trump, and then it flipped in the 2018 race, going around 13,000 in favor of the Democratic candidate. But again, population-wise, it's only around 3rd, and then compared to places like, for example, Myrtle Beach. Another area to talk about is this Charlotte-adjacent area. So these are counties like York and Union and Lancaster. A lot of it's based around Rock Hill, which is a very important area, but this area also leans Republican. Similarly to places like Gaston County or Union County in North Carolina, this is a pretty solid and stable Republican lead. And actually these areas like Chester County have trended a little bit to the Republican Party, although there is still some ancestral Democratic presence at the state level there. A few other smaller ones remain. For example, Beaufort, South Carolina, which is along the border of Savannah, Georgia, is another area that's a fairly large metropolitan area, but not exactly that big. Then we get in places like Florence, Augusta, or Sumter. Basically, there's a lot of metropolitan areas. Similar to North Carolina, the population in South Carolina is dispersed somewhat throughout the state. There's not one dominant metropolitan area. And to give you an example of this, I've created this map here, which is the political regions of South Carolina. So these are roughly the same population here. You'll notice it's within around 30,000 voters total. So the first political region is this area adjacent to the North Carolina border. And you'll notice this is the smallest geographically. This has around, and it's also the whitest, around 72% of the population is white. Then the second one stretches from Augusta, Georgia, to the areas adjacent to the North Carolina border, places like Florence, as well as the state capital of Charleston. And it's the most diverse area. Around 37% of the population is black. This is because a lot of it runs through the Black Belt. Finally, the third goes through a lot of the low country coastal areas and some of the Black Belt. And it's also, similarly, there is a fairly diverse area. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how this place voted in various elections. So the 2016 presidential election, show you the partisan lean. You'll notice a pattern here. This area adjacent to North Carolina's border, very conservative. Then Charleston is the second most conservative area, the southern tier, and then the intersection is the third most competitive area. In the gubernatorial race, you'll notice things slip a little bit, although again, this northern portion, rooted around Greenville, Spartanburg, and the Charlotte suburbs is again very conservative, even though these other two areas became much more democratic. Finally, I'll show you the Senate race in 2016. And all of these are conservative. This is because Tim Scott, the senator up for re-election then, was a very popular senator. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of some of these regions when we're talking about South Carolina. I'm going to throw it to Nick here, who's going to kind of explain to you a little bit of the demographics we're talking about with the state. So, places like the Black Belt and some of the population variant. Then we'll go into the history of elections in South Carolina to kind of give you an idea of what a competitive race would look like and also why Democrats are targeting the state in 2020.
Okay, so starting off, I want to look at this map, which is pretty much the spread of population in the state of South Carolina. As you can see here, you've got two very densely populated areas of the state. They're around Charleston and Columbia. They're the two biggest cities in the state. I can never remember which one is the biggest city, but they're about the same size. Not big cities by any measure relative to the rest of the country, but they do play an important role in South Carolina politics because you have got a dense cluster of people. Specifically to these two cities, they are very Democratic leaning. The suburbs of these cities, not so much. You got a lot of Republicans around the suburbs, and also you got this area here in the Upstate Region of the state, which includes Greenville and Spartanburg. Greenville County, which is right here, this is actually the biggest county in the state. It's even bigger than the ones that hold Charleston and Columbia. And even though it might not have like a dense urban core like those two cities have, this is generally a big metro area. Eric covered it on his map. And yeah, this is one of the key regions of the state, very heavily white and very rapidly growing as well, I believe. Maybe not now, but in the near and far future, you might actually see these areas become competitive. But for now, like in 2020, we don't expect these areas to be competitive. But the swings in these counties might prove to be useful for Democrats as they have some races which may or may not be competitive. Okay, now I actually want to go back to this map that Eric made, showing the regions of the state. Now, each of these regions is actually very distinct. They have several cultural and political differences, and in fact geographical differences. But this area marked 1, that's the Upstate Region. That's the area with those suburban counties up north. You got Greenville and Spartanburg, as mentioned earlier. Very heavily white, as you can see there. It's 72% white, and very Republican as well. This is also actually very mountainous. Very much so compared to the rest of the state. It actually has got some of those trends that you might see in other mountainous areas. And then you go down, you get the Midlands. These are the areas of the state which are actually some of the poorest in the country, but also very diverse. You got big African American populations around Richland County, which is where Columbia is, and also in some of those areas in the center of the state. This is actually essentially an extension of the Black Belt, which also includes Georgia and Alabama, and partly in states like Mississippi and North Carolina. This is probably one of the areas that's most representative of the southern nature of the state, because you got a heavy divide between white voters and black voters in the rural areas of the state, because white voters vote heavily Republican, black voters vote heavily Democratic, and that is similar to what you see in rural areas of states like Georgia and Alabama. Now, going south, you've actually got two regions here. First of all is the Low Country. This is the area that includes Charleston. You got actually several more those African American counties, I believe, in the higher part of the state. But you've also got Charleston. That's the main metro area. Democrats actually perform pretty well in this area, despite the fact that it is pretty heavily white. I believe Barack Obama won it and Hillary Clinton won it in 2016, and it now has a Democratic representative. The suburban areas of Charleston are typically Republican, but not as Republican as you might expect. And swings in this area might prove useful for Democrats in elections where they may be competitive, such as in South Carolina's 1st District in 2020, and arguably the Senate race. Now, the other region in the states, I think it's referred to locals as the PD. This is around Myrtle Beach, that sort of area. Actually, politically, it shows very similar trends to the Low Country. You've got several suburban voters, typically quite heavily white, but you do get a lot of those swing voters in that area. Overall, in the state, we can conclude that it is very diverse, and it's debatable how competitive the Democrats can get, especially in the near future in 2020 and future election cycles afterwards. But it could potentially turn into a competitive state in the future, and for Democrats to win here, they have to get a good coalition of those black voters in the rural and urban areas of the state, as well as those suburban white voters who are, as we could see from recent elections, are swinging quite drastically in the Democrats' directions. So they have to get that coalition of voters if they want to win that state.
So now that Nick has discussed a lot of the demographic factors that go into South Carolina politics, I'm now going to start to show you some of the recent history of presidential and Senate races. So let me share my screen. So starting with presidential races, we're going to start at the year 1976 and then go forward to the last presidential race in 2016. You can see here that Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford were the candidates in this race. Jimmy Carter was a native son of Georgia, which is neighboring to South Carolina, so this clearly gave him some sort of advantage. You can see that Carter swept over the vast majority of counties in South Carolina, including basically all the counties in the Black Belt, most of the rural counties, if not all of them. And then even in the Low Country, places like Horry County and Charleston County, he completely swept those areas. The two notable exceptions are Greenville over here. Even though Jimmy Carter did have an appeal to evangelicals, you can even start to see here that there is an aversion forming to Democratic candidates among those types of people. You can also see that Augusta and some of its suburbs that do sort of percolate into South Carolina. You can see also the suburban area around Columbia, which was still heavily white back then, did vote for Gerald Ford by a modest margin. Going into 1980, Ronald Reagan drastically improved over Gerald Ford's performance. This was because he made up significant ground in the Low Country, especially places like Charleston, Dorchester, Berkeley County, which are the counties right over here that are now somewhat competitive, specifically Charleston County, but you can see a significant shift to Republicans even since this time. You can also see those counties I mentioned previously becoming even more strongly Republican. And then you can see Spartanburg also voting Republican. And so you have the Greenville-Spartanburg metro area, which obviously helps buoy someone like Ronald Reagan up to victory in the state just because of how populous it is in comparison to other areas of the state. You can still see that much of the Black Belt did vote for Jimmy Carter, as well as some of those peripheral areas that are adjacent to North Carolina. Those are some areas that have started to shift more to the right, especially, as Eric mentioned, around sort of Rock Hill over here outside of Charlotte. But in the meantime, these are voting for Democratic candidates, at least at this point in history. 1984, as with most of the country, Ronald Reagan demolished Walter Mondale in the state. He won nearly 64% of the vote to 36 for Walter Mondale. A really bad performance in South Carolina, considering the state's history as a Democratic stronghold, the likes of Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats really having a grasp over power here. And you can see only scattered victories for someone like Walter Mondale, some counties in the Black Belt, and otherwise you really do see a Republican sweep over the vast majority of the state. Now, here's where things start to get interesting, because you can see that George H.W. Bush, did not actually do that much worse than Ronald Reagan. He got 62% of the vote as opposed to 64% of the vote for Reagan. And I think this is where we really start to consider the fact that South Carolina is a very inelastic state when it comes down to it. And we're going to see this more so in the 21st century, but because of demographic factors and prevailing political trends, we start to see that it's harder for a state like South Carolina to swing one way or the other as easily as they used to, just because there's a lot more stratification as far as how voters want to vote. And Michael Dukakis, unlike many other areas of the country, especially in the farm regions where he drastically improved over Walter Mondale, he did not have the same luck in South Carolina. Going to 1992, George H.W. Bush won the state fairly comfortably, around an 8% margin of victory, which is much better than he fared in neighboring states and in the South in general. States like Arkansas really did a lot better for Bill Clinton than he did here. And this is because you do see that lingering strength for Republicans, especially in the Charleston metro area, among seniors around Myrtle Beach, still along the Low Country, and then Greenville, Spartanburg. 1992 really was a pivotal election in the sense that evangelicals really start to line up behind Republicans, the likes of Pat Buchanan even showing up to the Republican National Convention that year. And that certainly had an effect among voters in Greenville, Spartanburg, many of whom, as I mentioned, are strongly and devoutly evangelical. And so you can see Republican strength here really not diminishing, even though George H.W. Bush did not have a good year here. Bob Dole had the same fate pretty much. You can see that his strength was still abundant in Greenville, Spartanburg, the Charleston metro area, as well as some of the outlying areas of Columbia, which again were much more white than some of the more African-American areas of Columbia. You can see that some of the more white working class counties, as I mentioned, which have drifted to the right in recent years, they still went fairly comfortably to Clinton. And so they made it such that Dole's victory was not overwhelming, but it was pretty sizable considering the fact that Robert Dole lost by around 8% nationally. And so he did significantly better here than on the national scale. 2000, with George W. Bush's victory, is where we really start to see Democrats hitting a ceiling in the state. You can see here that Al Gore was only able to garner 41% of the vote here, winning a smattering of counties, as I said, around Columbia and Orangeburg and Florence and other predominantly African-American areas. But again, he really did hit a ceiling because George W. Bush actually increased his margins in the northwestern, very urban, very populous region of the state with Greenville, Spartanburg, and even some of the college areas such as with Clemson. He also held his own in the Charleston metro area, in the Low Country of South Carolina. And this region at this point in time was solidly Republican on almost every echelon of government, including House representation. This is something that we'll talk about, because 20 years after this, things are starting to change significantly. Going to 2004, not much has changed. You can see some more solidified margins in red areas for George W. Bush, but otherwise, this was not really a defining election in the sense that both candidates won nearly the same percentage of the vote as 4 years earlier with the two-party share. 2008 is where things start to change a little bit. You can still see that John McCain, the Republican candidate, reported very hefty, very strong margins in the Greenville-Spartanburg area. But here's where we start to see the balance becoming a little more in favor of Democrats, in the sense that Democrats were starting to win Charleston County and just doing better in general in the Low Country. And so Barack Obama, with his nature as an African-American candidate and the first African-American president, really hit very strong margins in the Black Belt areas and the predominantly African-American areas, even as John McCain won much of the state overwhelmingly. And let me just note here that what we're starting to see as well is really the axiom that land does not vote. And South Carolina truly exemplifies this fact because John McCain won the state quite handily. Because if you look at in terms of area here, there's a lot of blue in comparison to red. And so on the face of it, if you had no idea about the population distribution, you might think, and justifiably so, that Democrats had even more strength in the state than they do if you look at the actual vote totals. 2012 was not an inflective point at all. It was not much different. Some modest Republican gains in the Low Country. Mitt Romney did improve upon John McCain's margins here. But even with, again, the border areas with states like North Carolina, Barack Obama did hold some strength among some of those voters. But ultimately, he could not win the state because, again, these suburban areas in places like Greenville, Spartanburg, the outlying more white areas of Columbia, and then much of the Low Country itself, especially with more senior citizens, around Myrtle Beach and Horry County, they really did deliver a strong margin to Mitt Romney. Donald Trump's victory was rather unexpected in the sense that he won by a larger margin, as you can see, than Mitt Romney. And this was as polls were predicting that Trump was going to win the state by low single digits. I recall seeing some polls that had him winning the state by around 5%. And so this was a state where Donald Trump could stand on or rest on his laurels and say the polling was wrong, because truly it was wrong when Trump won by 14% over a 10% victory for Mitt Romney. However, you do start to see some bleeding in some important areas for Trump. Trump did decently well in Greenville, Spartanburg. He did gain some votes here just because it is an explosively growing area, but he did worse than Mitt Romney, especially in the Charleston area. And this is a trend that's going to catch up with him because in 2018, what we're going to see is that a Democrat flipped the first district, which is based in Charleston County, and really made history through that. One other thing to note here is that the black counties, the so-called black belt counties here, are in a sense losing a lot of population. And so you do see that some of these areas did in fact shift a little bit towards Trump. And this was similar to such areas as the first district in North Carolina, where you had some heavily black counties that did shift mildly towards Trump. And also the second district in Georgia with Sanford Bishop. Some of those counties that are depleting in population are starting to slowly shift more to the right just because of political trends at play. So that's the presidential. Going to the Senate, we obviously have two classes of senators, but starting in 2002, a familiar face here, Lindsey Graham, was able to win by 10%, a comfortable margin. You can see that he won the North quite handily, Greenville, Spartanburg, as well as the Charleston the Charleston metropolitan area. He won quite comfortably. As expected, the Black Belt went largely towards Alex Sanders, the Democratic nominee, as well as some of these more blue-collar areas, if you will, particularly Rock Hill, which has now shifted, again, more to the right. But at the time, Democrats were able to win it in some of these races. The other senator you had here was Jim DeMint. Jim DeMint represented a district in South Carolina, and he actually ended up resigning in around 2013 to take a post as the president of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. But here you see a similar trend going on, or a similar result going on to Lindsey Graham, with the exception of Charleston voting lightly blue here. And this was sort of an anomaly in the sense that there were other Republican candidates around this time, like George W. Bush, who were able to win this county. 2008 was a good year for Barack Obama, but as I showed you before, not as much in South Carolina. Lindsey Graham won comfortably, 15-point margin. Not much to say here. You can still see some of the regional distinctions here with the North and the coastal regions, the low country, as they say, voting Republican, while the more middle areas, African-American majority, are voting Democratic. 2010, this is a favorable year to Republicans, very much so. And Alvin Green, the Democratic nominee, was not a particularly good nominee. He did not galvanize voters, and his policy stances were somewhat questionable. And so unsurprisingly, Jim DeMint won with over 60% of the vote. And so this is not a typical map that you'd see today, because you do see some of these middle areas voting even for the Republican candidate. Some of them have very strong African-American populations. So otherwise, this is sort of an aberration, because you would see closer races in usual circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to interject here real quick, because just to underscore how bad Alvin Green was, he raised literally no money. He raised $0. He was outraised by the Green Party candidate. Mm-hmm. That's the reason why you see those areas. Is not only was he such a bad candidate, he literally raised nothing. That's why you see a Green Party candidate getting about a third of the margin that he got.
Right. And also, if I recall correctly, when he was with the press and people asked him questions, he basically said the same thing for the answer. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but it wasn't exactly a probing answer for any of the things that he said. So that was just specific to this candidate himself. But Jim DeMint was able to, as I said, comfortably win. 2014, as I previously mentioned, Jim DeMint had resigned, and so you have Tim Scott from the first district which we will definitely talk about later. The first district did produce some notable statewide candidates, including Tim Scott as well as Mark Sanford, as Eric will go into a little bit. But he won quite comfortably, and his appeal with African Americans is quite notable, and he won a lot of these areas in the middle of the state. Lindsey Graham concurrently did quite well. Nothing much to say here. He did win Charleston County, and that's quite notable. Tim Scott, because 2014 was a special election, he had his regular election here, and he did quite well. And so Tim Scott, he is being thrown around as a potential future presidential candidate just because he has done quite well on the statewide level, and he has a lot of crossover appeal, and so this is quite notable.
Yeah, a great overview by Jared there. And I'm going to go ahead and go into the House and gubernatorial races because, again, you kind of need to understand all this stuff to get what we're talking about with the Senate election, which is the big election, I would say, of the 2020 in South Carolina. And if there's a reason you keep hearing us say Greenville, Spartanburg, it's because while people talk about Charleston quite a bit, Greenville, Spartanburg is the most important region in the state. And in order for Democrats to break through in South Carolina, they'll need to break through in this region. The evangelical support often draws quite a bit, for example, from Bob Jones University, which is a school associated strongly with the evangelical tradition and is just generally noteworthy as being an exceptionally Republican area. But going over the House race history is kind of important to also give you an idea of kind of the strength and the peril of Democratic candidates in South Carolina. So I want to go back to 2008 because this is the last time South Carolina Democrats really had a really strong ticket. So this is another example of land doesn't vote. So back in 2000, you had 6 congressional districts. So you had the first district, which stretched from Myrtle Beach to Charleston. You had the second, which stretched from the low country areas like Beaufort into Lexington and parts of Columbia. And then you had the other ones that had the rest of the state. This was a 4-2 delegation. Obviously, the 6th district is a majority African-American seat and is represented by a Democratic Congressman, Jim Clyburn. And then the 5th at the time was represented by John Spratt, a conservative Democrat. And this was, at the time, a more moderate seat overall because of these areas that it drew in. But this is a 4-2 map, and Democrats actually almost gained 2 seats in this election. Republicans only won the House popular vote by about a percentage point. And this is because Democrats got within 4 of winning the 1st district and got within 8 of winning the 2nd district. So this is what that map looked like. Obviously, John Spratt did really well in his district. He got over 50% of the vote, which is why you see so many of these counties here blue that are unthinkable today. Blue York County, blue Lancaster, to a degree Kershaw County, Cherokee and Union County, strongly Republican counties. And then on the other side of the 2nd district, you see Charleston here is already quite blue. Georgetown County, associated with Myrtle Beach, is blue. Horry County, which is Myrtle Beach, is barely red. It's not very red at all. And then a lot of these counties in African-American counties like Jasper, Hampton, Allendale, Bamberg, and Orangeburg, very strongly Democratic counties. And although Democrats were not able to flip any seats, it gave them hope for the future. This hope was quickly dashed. South Carolina gained a new seat due to population growth, and you'll notice the districts here are pretty obvious. The 4th district right here, this is the current map, is Greenville and Spartanburg, and it's by far the smallest district in the state if you look at it overall. That's because it's really concentrated in those 2 cities. There are a lot of rurals here, but overall it's a very different map than last cycle. The 2nd got rid of that portion that was stretching into the low country, added it to Jim Clyburn's seat, and then the 1st got rid of Horry County and just went purely into Beaufort, Hilton Head, Charleston. So Tim Scott represented the 1st district for a while. Mark Sanford represented it until recently, and now it's represented by Joe Cunningham, who is a Democrat, who had an upset victory there. So why is this so competitive of a region now at this point, the 1st district in particular? Well, I have a couple maps to show you to kind of give you an idea of the changes happening in the Charleston area. So this is the election in 2018. Obviously, this is a Republican area. Trump won the district by 11 percentage points, but Democrats are able to flip it. And they did so because the Republican nominee, Katie Arrington, was a pretty terrible candidate. But they also had growth in places like Beaufort County, Charleston in particular, did pretty well overall. If you look at the rest of the state, you see a similar story. Democrats actually only lost the popular vote by around 10. A pretty good margin overall. They were in pretty surprisingly well in places like the 5th, the 2nd congressional district, and the 7th. They did a pretty decent job overall. And House Republicans outran the the governor pretty much everywhere in the state, except for obviously the Low Country, which is experiencing those political trends. So that's the House districts. And finally, one more thing I want to go into before you go into kind of the Senate races and what we're really looking at for that election between Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham are these gubernatorial races. Again, to give you an idea of what a close election in South Carolina looks like. So 2002 was a close election. Incumbent Democratic Governor Jim Hodges was running for re-election, and he narrowly lost. And you'll notice here, because of that Greenville County had a lot of strength, Spartanburg, and Charleston, Mark Sanford was able to win. This is notable because Mark Sanford was more of a reformer of the conservative. He was associated with a less establishment wing of the party and more one that was more focused on fiscal conservatism and reform. Future Governor Nikki Haley was also part of this wing and was strongly associated with him. Mark Sanford was able to win decisively in 2006 by South Carolina standards. Although he didn't do as well in the rural areas, his strength in places like Greenville, Spartanburg, and Charleston really propelled him to a strong victory. And for a while, he was touted as a presidential candidate until his infamous affair scandal, which kind of wrecked his career. In 2010, Nikki Haley was the surprise winner of the Republican primary. She ran with Tea Party support, but also had that residual support from reformist conservatives. The problem is that kind of proved to be a negative for her overall. Vincent Sheehan was running a moderate campaign, but also just historically, candidates of parties who are running to replace people with sexual scandals of any type tend to underperform. So Nikki Haley did really well in a lot of the suburban areas, but did pretty poorly in some of these rural areas, including her home area of Bamberg, where she was from. But she still won this race overall. This isn't out of step with previous elections in South Carolina. State level races tend to be a little bit closer than federal ones. 2014, though, she decisively defeated Sheehan in a rematch. She still lost Charleston County, which, as you can see here, is pretty much decisively blue, but did manage to win back a lot of rural areas and really dominated in the upstate portions around Greenville and Spartanburg, but also around Clemson, which is, if I recall it, her alma mater. She's strongly associated with that area overall. Obviously, she resigned her office to become the UN ambassador, and her her lieutenant governor, Henry McMaster took her place. And this is where Democrats started to get really, really confident. This race wasn't projected to be competitive, but Democrats did overperform a little bit. James Smith was from Columbia, and you see he did very well in the Columbia area, especially in Richland County, where he was a state representative. And then the presence of Mandy Powers Norell on the ticket helped drive a little bit of the votes in the Charlotte area, where she represented in Lancaster County, a House district. But McMaster was still able to win strongly thanks to areas like Pickens County and Clemson, even though he slipped quite a bit in Greenville and Spartanburg. Myrtle Beach as well was also strongly conservative. Other races in the state were not as close. The Attorney General election was actually pretty comparable to the Senate races we've described earlier. But this is what has helped Democrats get really excited about South Carolina, is the fact that this race was really closer than it should have been. McMaster was not particularly unpopular, and so there was very, very little reason to go over this. So finally, we're going to talk about the current Senate election. And one thing I want to go over before we kind of shift into the discussion there is these regional shifts. So it's worth noting, for example, comparing to 2016. We've talked about Greenville and Spartanburg. Why is that so important? Well, it's because those areas actually trended Republican compared to in the 2016 election. Donald Trump won Spartanburg County by 11,000 more votes, roughly, than Mitt Romney did, and he only lost Greenville County by around 400 votes in Greenville County. So overall, that was enough to make up for the Charleston deficits. So that's definitely the reason to pay attention to Greenville and Spartanburg. And we're saying this a lot because it is important. You're not going to win a Senate election in South Carolina with just Charleston. You're going to need the whole state. You're going to need to get back those rural areas like Florence that has shifted towards Republicans. You're going to need to get areas around the Charlotte suburbs, and you're going to need to get, ultimately, Greenville, Spartanburg metropolitan area, as well as Columbia, to be more strongly Democratic. So there are really, aside from the Senate race, there's only one election to pay attention to in South Carolina. It's the 1st Congressional District House race. Elections Daily recently moved it to leans Democratic. We feel Nancy Mace is a strong candidate, but Joe Cunningham was able to outrun the top of the ticket. McMaster only lost the first he won the first by around 3, while Cunningham managed to win it. So we feel like he has some opportunity there. But the real race people are talking about is the Senate race between Jamie Harrison and Lindsey Graham. Polls have indicated a fairly close race, although as Jared mentioned earlier, polls in South Carolina can be notoriously unreliable. Polls in 2018 showed a race that was not close. They showed a double-digit win for McMaster, and he ultimately only won by single digits, whereas polls in 2016 showed a close presidential race that ultimately Trump managed to gain on. There are specific issues with some of these polls. Some of them have Republican samples that are fairly low. If you look at traditional exit polling, Republicans make up around 40 to 45% of the electorate. Some of these polls only have around 31 to 34%. Obviously, you can't go and unskew polls, but when you're looking at the credibility and reliability of a pollster, that does matter. Right now, Elections Daily has the race not as competitive as some other outlets do, and there's reasons for that. Specifically, the Greenville-Spartanburg area is the big one. We need to see some evidence there that Democrats are making substantial gains, and they did make gains last time. The problem was all the gains came from third parties. So what I want to do is kind of show you in South Carolina that example right here, and it's kind of the big one to kind of look at is to how the region went overall. So pulling back up my Metropolitan Areas map, you'll see what I'm talking about here, and we're talking about some of these regional trends. So 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump won the Greenville-Spartanburg area by around 33 percentage points. In 2018, McMaster only won it by around 26 percentage points. Why did this happen? Well, it's simple. All of those third-party voters right there, that 4.7% that went third party, as well as around 2% or 1% of Republicans went to the Democratic candidate. That's similar to what we saw in places like Oklahoma. The problem is that's not enough to flip this region. It's not actually showing a trend there. Spartanburg is still more Republican now than it was back in 2008. Places like the Fifth, another area, you see a similar trend. 58.4% in 2016, 58.3% in 2018. The areas where we actually saw shifts were areas that either James Smith represented, namely the second area right here, the Columbia area, where he managed to win it by 3 percentage points after, 11 percentage points after Trump would won it by, lost it by 3. And in the low country fourth area right here, which is the Charleston area, where Trump won it by around 3.5 and James Smith won it by around 5 percentage points. But what we're looking at when we're examining a competitive race is the trend of growth in other areas besides Charleston. You'll notice right here, Charleston only is around 664,000 people. But South Carolina is actually a fairly large state. That's not a huge percentage of the population in South Carolina. In fact, if you get rid of all of these just to see the total population of South Carolina, 4.6 million. So that's not exactly a decisive portion. Rather, that's one that is worth paying attention to. So if Democrats want to win the Senate race, what are they going to have to do? Well, it's pretty simple. They're going to have to regain some of the strength they lost around the Florence area. If you're a previous watcher of the map room, you'll notice this area is close to Robeson County, which we mentioned. This entire area has actually trended Republican overall. Places like Marion, Bennettsville, Florence, Darlington, all of these regions actually trended more Republican in 2016 than they did in 2012. Democrats are going to want to regain some of that rural strength. They're going to want to continue their growth in Charleston. They're probably going to want to aim to actually win the county this time by a large margin. They're going to want to aim to stem the growth in these Charlotte area counties, specifically York and Lancaster. Lancaster saw a pretty decisive shift towards President Trump last time. They're going to want to erase that. They're going to want to see growth in the Columbia area, specifically in the suburban counties around here. They're going to want to see a little bit of shift there. And finally, they're going to want to make that breakthrough. I think it's safe to say if Democrats want to win the seat, they're going to want to push the margins in the Greenville-Spartanburg area from the 64% or 63% margin down to something like 56, 57%, or even 55%. The question is if that's viable or if that's possible. And it's certainly an open one for sure. But overall, there are reasons for Democrats to be optimistic, but I think some of us here at Elections Daily and some of us who are paying attention to this race in general, I think we need to see a little bit more evidence, specifically from the polling and specifically from regional polling from these different areas around the state, the Greenville area, Charlotte, Myrtle Beach, and Columbia. Those are going to be the ones to really pay attention to when election night comes in. So overall, South Carolina is obviously a state where Democrats have a pretty high floor. It's pretty difficult for them to get below 40%. The problem is, as was shown, they have difficulty getting above 46%. So the question is whether with Jamie Harrison, by all means a charismatic candidate, they're able to get above that margin. And that's ultimately something we'll be paying attention to. Right now, the polls indicate a fairly close race. But the question is whether those polls are credible, whether they're telling the story, and whether they ultimately reflect the election day atmosphere, which could very well be different on election day than it is right now.
Okay, so after Eric's explanation, I wanted to drive him a few points through some of the maps I made on Dave's redistricting. So I'm going to share my screen again. So I just want to show you a few short things rather quickly. First, I have a 4-3 congressional map. It's not supposed to be realistic in any sense, but really what it shows is that land is not voted. You can see that the Republican districts are far more dense, are far more compact, and are far narrower than the Democratic districts. And so South Carolina is unusual, again, in the sense that a lot of the land is very rural, but also very Democratic just because of demographic factors. And there's a lot of condensed urban vote that goes heavily towards Republicans. If Republicans wanted to pack the most possible Democrats possible into a single district in 2020, then they'd have something sort of like this if they wanted to be very egregious. You can see that there are tendrils that stick out into more rural areas as well as cities like Sumter, Columbia, especially some of the more African-American areas are there, Orangeburg, and then Charleston as well, while also dipping into some of the low country areas around Beaufort. My final map is a theoretical fair map. What I wanted to do here is I wanted to accentuate the African-American vote that's evident in the 6th district. So Jim Clyburn, no matter how you cut it, is going to have his district here that is going to be mostly African-American in demographics. But also with Joe Cunningham, you can see, or you could see from the 2018 map that there were some areas that McMaster bled in, some Republican districts that were rather close. And so if you wanted to condense and make a Democratic-leaning seat, you could definitely do that. And this is a seat that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. It contains Charleston, Beaufort, so these low country areas. We're also going in up to some more Democratic areas around Allendale and such areas. The final thing I want to show you, something I do quite regularly, is on the state legislative level. This is C-Analysis, a great website, a great resource for this. What I want to show you quickly was one specific race. This is showing the House forecast for the South Carolina State House in 2020. One very specific race I wanted to quickly show you was this House race, House District 115. It actually had a special election. And this is a race that was supposed to be competitive. And this is a seat that Trump did worse than Romney in. And Joe Cunningham was actually able to win this seat and secure it for Democrats. But this was supposed to be a competitive seat in the special election earlier this year. But what we saw was actually that the Democrat, Spencer Wetmore is the current incumbent, but the Democrat was able to win by a substantial margin. He was able to get over 55% of the vote, nearing 60% of the vote, which is actually better than Joe Cunningham. And so if you're trying to understand the rationale behind Elections Daily moving the 1st district, which takes in a lot of these areas, to lean Democratic, I'll point you to the fact that districts like these and just regions or areas around here in general are moving very rapidly Democratic. That's not to say that it's going to determine or bode well for Jamie Harrison and cause him a victory, just because a lot of those populous areas of Greenville and Spartanburg are still heavily Republican. But this is a region of optimism for Democrats, and it is a region that Democrats will be able to gain in the very near future.
And so with that, I think we'll wrap up this week's edition of the Map Room. Pretty dense episode, as you can see, but when you're explaining a state like South Carolina and its prospects going forward, you really need to look kind of granularly to see these opportunities. So where can we find you guys on social media, Jared and Nick?
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is @JStonePolitics.
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is Toss-Up Report.
And you can find me on Twitter @DCunningham2. You can also find all of our writings at Elections Daily. That's elections _daily and elections-daily.com. We do all sorts of stuff. We do podcasts, articles, all sorts of stuff throughout the week. And so, please check that out. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to Old Bull TV if you like this episode and want to keep track of the episodes we're doing in the future. And yeah, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you on next week's edition of The Map Room.